Madhavi Venkatesan, and I am a professor of economics, and I teach at Bridgewater State in Massachusetts. The reason why I picked this particular talk, which the slide will come up to remind you of the title in a moment, is related to basically my background. I left academics and I went into the private sector for several years. I worked as an equity analyst, and then I worked as an investor relations officer for publicly traded insurance companies, specifically dealing with mortality, morbidity, and catastrophic risk. And when I was in those positions, the thing that came to my mind often was related to both the investment cycle in terms of the quarterly return cycle that we go through, as well as the individuals in terms of their looking at both the returns and the price of everything that they purchase. So I had the benefit of going back to academics recently, and I'm very happy for that, just as much as I'm happy to see all of you here so that you can give me some of your own thoughts with regard to my topic. When I went through economics classes many, many years ago, the demand and supply schedules were taught to us. We understood that they were preference and value embedded, but the conversation just stopped right there. When I came back into academics, the same thing continued to persist. But when I think about this era that we're in currently, an era where we see the actionable elements of climate change activity, where we see and we hear daily about land mass destruction, deforestation, species extinction, environmental degradation of all kinds, the tangibility of those factors in terms of their not being on American soil, I think impact us in a way that they probably should not. In other words, we don't necessarily look at supply and demand the way that we should as being the causal forces, and even more so, the elements supposedly embedded within supply and demand as being the causal forces for the degradation that we see around us. So just looking specifically at demand, which we have an opportunity to talk about in every class, whether it be principles of micro, macro, or even upper level courses, we can address very simply what are the preference structures there, and where is the asymmetry of information in terms of the actual action of those preference structures. And what I mean by that is, if you ask your students, or if we asked each other right now, in terms of our social values and how we perceive life, would any of us feel indifferent or definitely raise our hands and say, no, we don't want to see animals harmed just so that we have something to consume? I doubt very many of us, if we had to make that type of decision, would say, that's not a problem for me. I don't care about the pain and suffering of another organism just as long as I have my burger. The problem is the tangibility of that factor of the pain and suffering of other creatures, the pain and suffering of other peoples, the degradation of environmental resources. Those are not tangible to us. We have barriers that separate our actions from our value structures. And that portion is an opportunity that we need to bring back into our classrooms. It's a great opportunity that we have to acknowledge the disconnect between what we fundamentally say we believe in and how our actions actually totally disregard our beliefs. Part of that is part of a more systemic issue, which we won't talk about today, but I'll leave that to you for your own thoughts. And the systemic issue I have, and what we all know, because we see this today, most of us did not grow up during the internet age. Most of us were around when the World Wide Web was just starting out. Information is so accessible today, yet if you ask a question, most students will not take the effort to Google it or even look it up. So the accessibility of information necessarily has not necessarily made us more cognizant of our actions. In some ways, it's probably eliminated our responsibility for them. So in my class, what I love to do, I get to do this every day. I enjoy this because I get to see the aha moments on the faces of my students. I get to read the reaction papers that come out of the assignment that I'm going to show you today. And I'll tell you a couple of different ways that this assignment plays out. It has validity both in a micro and a macroeconomics course. On a micro course, obviously, when we're looking at demand, you can look at individual behaviors. When you're looking at a macro course, you look at it rolled up in terms of how consumption is driven in our economy, right? Marketed consumption. But fundamentally, the other component that we also get to talk about is why is it that we're marketed to, and why do we have this reflex consumption process, right? It's also, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's sort of consistent with regard to so many other reflex reactions that we do in terms of government action and how we look at investments. We look at it on the surface, look at it in a soundbite. So that's just food for thought for later. Going to the specific assignment, what we end up doing is we look at a particular product. In my case, we start off with a bottle of water. And I look at a bottle of water that's in glass, right, on purpose. Because a glassed bottle of water does not have the same leaching aspects that we would see with plastic, number one. And in terms of emissions, there's a totally different way of looking at emissions when you think about the creation of water and for a bottle of water, in a glass. And also in terms of disposal as well as in reuse. So we'll take a bottle of water and glass water, look at tap water on top of it because we know that it's regulated. We have a Safe Drinking Water Act. We could talk about the contaminants related to that because of its regulatory component. We know that that information is publicly accessible to us. Using that baseline in terms of the nutrient value of that water, the resources that go into the creation of that glass bottle, we have a baseline level of understanding of the environmental impact and the human health impact and the waste impact of that bottle of water. We use publicly available resources, which are changing all the time. That's why I didn't necessarily introduce them here. And also, there's another reason why I didn't introduce them, because I didn't want us to get hung up on the specific website. There's so many of them to look at. So I will touch on those in a moment. But if you then take another item that you consume, I typically let my students pick one that they consume. It could be any kind of caffeine beverage, a soda beverage. I'm not going to name them here just because it may not be appropriate given this is a public forum. But you take that same product and then you ask them to look at the market price that they paid for it, and then we'd start a subjective analysis. This happens over a course of 2 classes, typically, and it can be done in many different ways. This has been a written and published assignment, so I'm very happy to share it with any of you should you want a copy. But what we then can do is we can look at the container. There's so many ways to calculate the footprint of that container in terms of its emissions footprint, in terms of the types of inputs that were used, especially if it's plastic. Also in terms of any kind of leaching issues that may come because of its substance that's made out of, that will leach back into the drink or beverage that the student's going to imbibe at some point. That's one aspect. So that's the production phase of the bottle, right? Then we have the production phase of the consumable element inside the bottle. There is a great website on the USDA on the web page, where you can actually look at the nutritional components of almost any food that's out there in the market. And it breaks it down. So you can see very clearly, like, if I eat this particular or drink this particular good, can I have lunch? Because until you actually see those numbers, you don't make it tangible to someone how much the caloric intake is, or how much the acidity intake is. So that portion then is the consumable footprint to the individual, the nutrient level, the sugar level, how much calorie they have to sacrifice in terms of other foods that they could eat because they've ingested this. It makes it tangible to them, plus it's also a website that they can use for their own use for other things. But the other component there, too, is another learning experience. If you're dealing with a food product that has a lot of sugar, you can go ahead one step further and look at the water footprint of that beverage itself. Because a lot of students find it very surprising when you think of water, which we don't even price, because we look at it as an abundant resource rather than looking at it from a scarcity angle. And when you see that there's typically 5 to 10 times the amount of water that's needed to create the same amount in 1 unit of a beverage. So, for example, a 1 liter bottle of Coca-Cola, or for any soda for that matter, would take up to 3 to 4 to 5 gallons of water in addition to the water that's already in the product. That's a big eye-opener because right then you're seeing, especially in a world where we claim we have water scarcity, how much water we're using. So there's that secondary footprint component. Then you have the actual production footprint. How much are we using in terms of energy, emissions? How much adverse impact is the production process of this good in terms of its packaging causing the environment as well? Typically, that's very easy to find on the internet as well. And then the more important element that we talk about in terms of scale a lot of times in economics is the centralization of a lot of our production. The centralization actually enhances the footprint of distribution. So that's another element that you can actually bring in when you talk about this. So now we're only halfway through the life cycle, right? So we started off with the production of the container, the production of the product, the footprint of the ingredients of that product, then the footprint related to the actual creation of the marketable product, then the distribution of that product, now to the actual consumption of that product, where that caloric intake actually takes hold for that individual, and the decisions have to be made should they have that information. Typically, there's an asymmetry there, right? So then after that consumption life is done, you have the waste of whatever the residual is of that product, which we don't typically think about at all, because we throw things away. And that big black hole calls away. So that portion is actually another eye-opener for many students, to think that their trash is incinerated. Many of them don't even realize that. And trash incineration has a lot of emissions components to it. Now, why is this all important? From an economic perspective, if we only look at things at one cross-section of time, we're only evaluating the market costs and the impacts that we can see. But rational decision-making means that we should be looking at things not only in terms of what's happening today, but their overall impact on tomorrow. So arguably, our consumption choices are actually leading to our own demise or a shortage of our own lifespans because of our lack of cognizance or a lack of complete understanding of the impact of our consumption choices and the ripple impact of those. So that is what my assignment really tries to get at for my students. It gets at on an individual level for principles of micro students. On a macro scale, we talk about it from the standpoint of the components of GDP itself, because as you all are very well aware, in the United States, we're very slow to actually discuss anything outside GDP. We still seem to rely on it very heavily in terms of our curriculum, whereas the rest of the world has started to look at other types of indicators to actually address the issues that we're seeing today in terms of what other indicators would potentially be of value to us to actually gauge human quality of life. So on another level, in an environmental class, which typically most people will want to segregate this type of assignment to, which I think would be very much a disservice to our students today, you could actually bring this out in a much larger and broader scale by looking at each component and going through an actual analysis for it. And in an environmental and sustainability type class, you could also add to it, because economists could actually put in a point there that we are a consumer-based society, and until we actually create something or bridge that gap between the symmetry, bridge the gap between the information on both ends, we will continue to have this reflex consumption. So I started off saying something, but I drifted off for one moment, and I want to come back to it. The one element that we start off in my classes with is an understanding that the frameworks that we inherit are the frameworks that we inherit. They didn't descend on us. They just came through the generations. What may have been appropriate at one period of time may be appropriate for that one period of time. Just like economic theory evolves because we look at the behaviors of people around us at a given point in time. And those theories are based on the values of the people that are in those societies at that point in time. Values change as societies commingle. Pluralism has affected and secularity has affected how we think about things. And we have to bring those gaps into play. And the only way we really can is to educate our students with regard to the types of decisions they're making, and implicitly what their preferences are and how they're exercising their preferences through their actual decision making. So in a very long description without many slides, I hope I've provided to you the justification for why life cycle analysis should actually be entered into your discussion of supply and demand. It is the consumer or the individual economic agent that really bears the greatest power in our economy for the changes that we need to make. Thank you.